Hi everyone, my name is Chike Coleman and that's Sanford, Hess, and we're back for another edition of Real Reviews Rewind. This is the show where we talk about films from the past and sometimes occasionally things from the present, or what I like to call new classics. This week we're going to be talking about a great film from 1958 directed by Jacques Tati called Mon Oncle, and then we're going to follow that up with a very compelling documentary called Three Identical Strangers. But first, let's start our discussion on Mon Oncle. So, Mon Oncle, directed by Jacques Tati, and I think also written by Jacques Tati, tells the story of, what else? An uncle who comes to visit and stay with this family of his who happen to be very technologically into their lives. Like, they're very technologically sound. They're keeping up with the Joneses. And the film basically follows this character. I forget what the character's name is. Do you remember?
Who? The uncle?
Yes.
Mon Oncle?
Well, yeah.
Yeah, I don't think he actually has a name.
He doesn't, but it's a repeated character that Tati uses.
Yes.
So, essentially it follows the calamities that Mon Oncle gets into with his nephew and the nephew's friends, and also the nephew's parents, all the little calamities that ensue. This is what I like to call a sight gag film, because it's all very attention based on what are you paying attention to in the scene, what's there in the moment that's going to make you laugh. I'll give you one very broad example, audience. You have a guy, he's walking to work, and he's minding his own business, and out of nowhere he hears someone do a really loud whistle, and while he's walking he hears that whistle and he looks back and he keeps walking and he hits a pole while he's walking. This kind of stuff is small, minute, but hilarious, and a very big trademark of the type of sight gag you would see in Tati's films. I personally, when I first saw this in American film class, credit of Stacy Gross, I thought it was hysterical, but I was always wondering, well, what's going to happen next, because you never know where the sight gag is coming from. This film has a lot of heart towards the very end of it, but for me what makes it really work is the sight gag humor, because you're not expecting it, you don't know where it's going to come from, and it's enveloped with this playful kind of like carnival or childish music that really gets you invested in the environment you're in. So I really love this film. I want to know what you thought, Sanford, since this is the one film we saw together.
That's right, which is rare for us to watch the film together. I think this big thing I have about this movie is it is a movie of its time and place, which is a sort of soft way of saying, I didn't really like it that much. But I'm a big fan of the statement that I will watch any genre of movie, and I'm looking for a movie that executes well in its genre. And I think this one does. I mean, in the sense that this film is an example of a Tati film. I've seen one other, and stylishly they're very similar. He uses these elaborate sets and colors and very pre-planned what's going on. I mean, this is the opposite of a sort of improvised film or anything else. Everything is down to the step, and all the shots are carefully orchestrated, and he's picked out the colors and everything very specifically. Now, that being said, if you want to see a movie that will help you understand why, say, Jerry Lewis has a reputation in France, this is a good film for it, because this is an example of a clown, so the clown character in French film, which is, I wouldn't say it's a clown character in the sense that he is doing all these funny things. It's more that funny things are happening around him.
Yes.
So, but, his character he doesn't say very much. He has very few lines.
Yes.
He interacts with people in a very sort of, very low-key way.
Yes.
But funny things happen around him.
Yes.
So, I mean, it's great on those levels, and you can appreciate it, and from a film appreciation perspective, you can say, I see on this movie, kind of, that's very interesting use of color, it's very interesting use of I thought it was striking that there's so little dialogue that's intelligible. You know, we were watching it,
Yeah.
and we were kind of waiting for the subtitles to kick in. We're like, well, there's...
It took like 5 minutes before something happened.
They're saying stuff, but it's still in French. But that's because, and actually, I was reading, there's an English dubbed version, and I like this, in the dubbed English version, all the background noise, which is what we were hearing and being like, there's no subtitles. All of that is still in French because you don't need to understand what they're saying to sort of appreciate the noise level of what's going on. So when you actually, you know, there's very little dialogue that actually got to the subtitles, and then when it kicked in, we were like, oh, whew.
Yeah. I was
Okay,
like,
good.
Did we go back to a silent film for a second?
Yeah. So that's my statement. It's a good example of a genre. I don't think it holds up very well in this day and age.
It definitely would not if you tried to reinvent it for modern times. Because I will say the one major negative about this film, and everyone should be prepared for it, is it is a slow burn. Very, very slow until that one little comedic beat hits, and then you wonder, okay, what's going to happen next? Then another slow section, and then you wonder, oh my gosh, what's going to happen next?
Yeah, and some of the jokes are funny because they recur.
Yes.
You know, sort of they have so you know the uncle. It's the uncle's sister and her husband live in this really fancy modern house. And we'll get to that sub theme in a second. But I mean, there's a sort of ongoing joke about how she'll turn on the fountain, but only if it's an important person.
Yeah.
You know, and there's this whole process to turn it on and process to turn it off.
Yeah.
Or the gate. So I think that's an important subcomponent of this film is this whole idea about technology. So I'm a technology guy, so I kind of picked up on that very, you know, I was very attuned to that part of the film because here's one couple who are totally plugged into all this plastic and convenience. You know, her kitchen is an example of all these modern technologies. And then here's the uncle who's the exact opposite. You know, he lives, you know, he's got his clothes hanging outside of his house on this line. You know, he's the opposite of all of those things. So what do you think this movie's trying to say about technology?
Well, first of all, part of the reason I chose Mon Oncle as one of our films this week is because I know you're a technology guy.
Yeah.
The reason behind why I think technology plays such an important part is because it shows us and shows the viewer how much obsessively, even at that time, we use it.
Right.
I'm specifically referring to cars and how cars get repainted and how boys who are poor would, you know, make practical jokes on good-looking cars and to make it sound and appear like there was an accident when there really wasn't. And how obsessed people are with appearance and keeping up with the Joneses, much in the same way in the current state of affairs we are now. And I thought that that was a wonderful commentary on that side of life. So that's where I think the theme comes from.
And that gag with the kids in the car was actually one of the funnier ones.
Yeah, it was great.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, this movie, you know, I look outside of it and I say, okay, here's Tati. He's using all of these filmmaking tricks and technologies to do this, yet he's making a sort of counterpoint statement in the movie that says, hey, you shouldn't get hung up on all these conveniences because ultimately the couple that has this fancy house and all these conveniences are sort of very shallow people. Or at least based on his nephew who doesn't really like his parents but loves his uncle. He's saying, you know, on a subtle way, hey, you should just relax and not get into all this other, you know, craziness of keeping up with the Joneses.
And in a way, the film has a very Mary Poppins ending with the dad and the son.
Yes.
Which I kind of found really endearing and deeply heartwarming.
Yeah, I agree. I thought that the ending was, I liked the ending a lot in the sense that it gave them, you know, it actually had character growth. I mean, there's, you know, so many movies that we see, it's kind of like, well, here's characters and then stuff happens and not much changes in their lives.
Right.
But this movie did end with the dad and the son making a connection and, you know, that was growth.
There was a little bit of growth there, a little bit of growth. And for me, watching, and I figured out the uncle's name in my head, Mr. Hulot.
Ah, you're right.
watching all those calamities occur was really fun for me when they occurred, but the slow parts made me want to fall asleep. Might possibly be because I was eating dinner at the time we were watching.
Right, and we started the movie kind of late.
We did.
Yeah, I guess there's the tip, is to start it before,
You do anything heavy. So, did you have a favorite scene in the movie?
I think I liked this. It was like a 20-minute scene too. The sort of garden party in the garden where there's all these calamities occur, and it's just sort of a series of sight gags.
Yeah. That to me is one of the best scenes in the movie, but it's not my favorite.
Ooh, what was?
My favorite was the staircase scene where he has to go up and down the staircase of his apartment, and there are all these little windows, and you're wondering, wait, which way is he gonna go? Because we know he's gonna pop up somewhere.
Yeah.
And then you wait for him, and he doesn't show up there, but he goes over there, and it's like, what?
Yeah. Those are the shots that were so carefully plotted out, with the sort of camera moving and bringing you, and you're following him with your eyes, and the camera's following him. But then, like you say, he kind of does different things, but it was all one continuous shot.
Yeah.
I mean,
and that's what I found beautiful about it, is that it's one continuous shot, and your eyes are not breaking away because you're wondering where is he going to appear, what's he going to do, and then when he has to reverse and go back down, you're still wondering, is he going to change direction? What's going to happen?
Right. Do you want to talk about the inappropriate relationship with the neighbor for a minute?
Oh, do I?
Talk about a movie of its time and place.
Yes, so, full disclosure, audience, there is something really creepy in this movie that makes no sense to either of us. It's the fact that there's this really, would I give her credit by calling her beautiful, or should I just leave it?
More importantly, she's a teenager.
She has to be.
Maybe like 16.
15, 16, and seriously, she does the creepiest things.
Well, she's just essentially throwing herself at this
to greet Mr. Hulot,
55-year-old.
literally like 5 times throughout the movie, and we're just sitting there like, what does this mean? And at the end of the movie, he basically acknowledges her. But it's like, it's okay, I gotta go now.
Yeah.
Bye. And you're just like, what is the point of that specific set of circumstances?
Well, I mean, and there's the question of why did he include that in the film, which I think was more of an ego boost for himself. Hey, what 16-year-old girl wouldn't throw herself at me? But to me, it's one of those things that sort of highlights how times are different than the 65 years ago when this film was made.
Now I have to beg an intellectual question here. Are they though? Like Donald Trump basically saying he would be in a relationship with his own daughter. Bill Cosby taking advantage of.
So I would say this.
People.
I mean, I would say what's different about today's day and age is that people do not just say, "Oh, it's Bill Cosby. He's a nice guy," and there's a certain sense of.
Though?
In the 70s, maybe, but I think there's a revulsion towards that kind of behavior now that has changed. The behavior goes on because, obviously there's examples of it all the time. What's changed, I think, really in the last couple of years especially, is the lack of tolerance by society for this to just sort of be, oh, that's just Tati being a crazy old guy hitting on some young girl, or writing a script where she hits on him.
Yeah, and I realized this in my head just now, and it's great. The only person who could get away with that is Hugh Hefner.
Who's dead.
Who's dead now.
But also, yeah.
But he sounds like he was such a respectable person, though, despite his many wives. Like, if you look at interviews with, like, past people in that industry...
Yeah.
I haven't heard a negative word yet.
So I would say this. Hugh Hefner at least was never duplicitous about what he was doing.
Agreed.
He's out there. He says, hey, this is who I am. I'm not going to pretend to be, grandpa by day and then lecherous old man in the shadows. I'm up front telling you right now I'm a lecherous old man.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a clear distinction. But... that's another thing that made Tati's film so amazing and so remarkable. If you have time for sight and humor, and if you're okay with Tati basically having a 16-year-old girl flirt with him,
Yeah.
then please do see My Uncle, because there's a lot of great commentary inside it for people to digest, especially if you're a classic film lover. So,
And I'm going to put my softer recommendation on, if you want to appreciate sort of where some of the French New Wave cinema was coming from and appreciate, you know, sort of some important films, sure, see this movie, but if that's not your thing, you may want to steer clear of Mon Oncle.
yeah.
That's my review.
I would agree with that, but I'd still say for the sight gags alone, see this movie.
Okay.
All right, so for our second and final film of the week, we are going to be talking about Three Identical Strangers. This is the story of three people seemingly unrelated. Bobby Saffron, Eddie Gallahan,
Something like that.
And-
I'm impressed you remember their last names.
and the third person, what, I don't
Danny?
No. There's a third brother, and I
Isn't
can't,
it Daniel?
we'll say Danny for the purposes of the show.
I think so. I could be wrong.
So,
Name check me on that, yeah.
So essentially, the story follows these three individuals. Bobby goes to college, and when he goes to college for the very first time, doesn't know anybody at his new college because he just got there. He gets the warmest welcome. Everybody's saying hi. Hi, how are you? How's your summer? Girls are kissing him on the lips. He's like, what is this odd thing? Rather than going with the flow, which is what I would have done. And he's like, what is going on? And then finally somebody says, hi, Eddie. And then Bobby goes, I'm not Eddie. What's going on? And then he realizes that through one of Eddie's friends, he has somebody that looks just like him. So they race across the country to make a phone call to Eddie at his house.
Well, he's not that far away.
He's like
Yeah.
3 hours away. So they call Eddie at a payphone. They say, Eddie, I think you've got a brother. Eddie's like, oh, okay.
They have the same birthday.
They have the same birthday.
They were
Let's look
adopted from the same agency.
Adopted.
They find those facts right away in the phone call.
Yeah, they find out all the facts right away in the phone call, and then they meet up. And lo and behold, they do look the same. They are brothers. They spend a lot of time together. And then what, a week later? They don't really establish a time frame for this.
Yeah, there's stories are published about them, so they kind of, yeah, you're right. They don't make it clear. Let's say it's weeks, within weeks.
A couple weeks later, a woman is on a train and sees the article and tells her friend, hey, you were born on this day too, from the same agency. You might have brothers. And so then all three of them meet up. And it's like instant chemistry. They do all the same things. They like the same girls. They all three smoke Marlboros. And it's great. Because
I love that that's like this thing is the way they all smoke the same cigarette brand.
Yeah, I know that. That to me was weird. They all like older girls. So essentially what happens is they get a lot of notoriety from their appearances and from the money that they, I guess, make from those appearances and whatever jobs they do after college. They make a restaurant called Triplets, where they're the star attraction and the food is great and business is good. But the parents are still, at this point, like, wait, how did this happen? Why weren't we told that these other two boys or this other brother or that other brother existed? So then the documentary goes into a turn.
Yeah, so let me pause there and emphasize that this is one of the cool things about this documentary is that it has sort of acts, much like a play. So what you've just described is this first act.
Yeah.
You know, and the first act ends in a good place where it's like, hey, everybody's happy and these guys are together and they get famous and they're on these talk shows and they open this restaurant. And isn't this awesome that they find each other?
Yeah.
And then the second act begins.
And the second act, how much do we want to go into spoiler?
I think you can go into it deeper.
So essentially we find out through talking with the brothers, I'm going to say the brothers for now, that they were adopted from this agency, and they're trying to figure out who their birth parents are, and the parents are trying to speak to the adoption agency, and they go to the adoption agency and say, "You did this. What happened?"
Right.
And the adoption agency says, "Well, this and this and this happened."
Right. I mean, I think the key question of the parents is, why didn't you tell us there were brothers? Because each of the parents who was raising one of the triplets was unaware of the other brothers.
Right.
So their anger source is, why did you withhold this information from us?
Yes, the agency gives an explanation, or a half-hearted one.
Barely.
And then the parents leave. But, you know what? One of the parents goes back to get their umbrella that they left, and they see those exact same people drinking champagne and toasting each other like they dodged a bullet.
Yeah.
I wonder why. So, meanwhile, while all this is going on, you've got an interesting family connection with one of the brothers' fathers, Babula. They all love Babula.
Yeah, so they kind of fill in the backstory of the families.
And you know...
And the families are from different socioeconomic levels.
Right. Different socioeconomic levels, so, which means they were raised differently.
Right.
And we basically learned that these twins and triplets being separated was part of a study.
Right.
By a guy named Dr. Nurnberg.
So that is sort of Act 2.
That's Act 2.
Is, you know, we wind up learning that this was intentional and that the boys were studied in visits that went on to their homes where they were given tests and recorded for the purposes of this research.
For years.
For years.
And, of course, this upsets the brothers when they learn this information. But they're too busy being happy about the fact that, hey, we're brothers, so it doesn't really dawn on them that heavily. Then we move into Act 3, and that's where it really gets strange.
Right.
Now, Act 3 reveals to us that, you know, it really wasn't as much about nature versus nurture in terms of socioeconomic status and in terms of strategically placing these triplets into different economic settings. This was about studying parenting.
Well, and that's, to me, that's where it's kind of interesting in Act 3 is it's a little bit of everything.
It really is.
Yeah, because at one point, it felt like to me they were sort of making, at one point in the film, they're kind of like, and, you know, here are these three boys who were raised separately, and look how similar they are ultimately.
Yeah.
So they're sort of, at one point in the movie, they're kind of making a statement that says, boom, triplets, even raised differently, are going to wind up the same.
Right.
And that's kind of in the Act 1 part. Mm-hmm. And then in Act 3, they change the tone of that, and like you say, sort of say, well, but actually, they're very different people, and a lot of that is due to the way they were raised.
Mm-hmm. And playing on the nature versus nurture. But the thing that I found most fascinating about this, and they detail this very briefly, but I never forgot it, and it's the thing that haunted me the most about this film, the mental illness piece of it. Wherein, yes, this was done to other twins where they're separated and whatnot, and there have been signs that there may have been other forms of mental illness involved in the parent before they had the child or after they had the child they're in, and the child was adopted. And does that carry over? And you wonder, well, does it?
Well, I think, and those are some of the unresolved questions, the movie dances around this sort of idea that maybe this was done on purpose with people who, you know, who had mental health problems. Or what I felt like at the same time, and this is just sort of my justification, maybe people who are giving children up for adoption are, you know, the scenarios that, worth noting, all the scenarios they talked about was sort of young mothers who had gotten pregnant and, you know, weren't married and wanted to give up the kids for adoption.
Right.
So maybe the personality traits that lead someone into being a young mother could be associated with mental health issues.
So what overall, now knowing all three acts that we've told the audience, did you think about Three Identical Strangers?
Wow. I thought a lot of things. I'll tell you the number one thing I thought was that I liked it better the second day when I thought back on it than I did during the movie. Because during the movie, I felt like it was a little simplistic at times, but I think that was intentional in retrospect because they wanted to veer you off in one direction so that they could come back in another direction and sort of shake you up. I like that. I like that they sort of were playing with your again, oh yeah, well these, it's got to be nature because all three of these triplets are so similar. Oh wait, maybe it's nurture. And I felt like that was very manipulative. I also felt like, by the way, this movie was manipulative in the way that they conducted the interviews.
Yes.
Specifically, first of all, a lot of it sounded very rehearsed. Like they had them repeat those things many times and maybe like took the best cut, which it's a doc. I don't know if I really approve of that or not. Also, there was a lot of, there were scenes where they sort of would show one of the brothers being interviewed, but it was like silent. They were just catching the look on their face. They were trying to replicate the look on their face that had happened. And I was like, well, that's kind of weird. I don't know. So I didn't like that manipulative part of it. Also, one final complaint, just there's a lot of scenes in there that they sort of recreated with actors, which is not horrendous. It's not only them who does that, but I'm not a big fan of that.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
I'm going to quickly give my thoughts on Three Identical Strangers.
Yes, please.
I absolutely love this film.
Okay.
I'm going to equate this film to boxing match counters. Just when you think they're going to punch you in one way, they go the other way instead.
Yeah.
I love this film for the relationship between the brothers. We only get to meet 2 out of the 3 in modern day, and the reason for that is, unfortunately, the third brother committed suicide. The most enigmatic and charismatic of the brothers committed suicide. And it seems like neither of the brothers really know why.
Well, and that ties into the whole mental health aspect.
And that ties into the whole mental health aspect. But I found it really heartwarming, not only that the brothers found each other, because that's going to be heartwarming on its own, but the dogged determination to not only just say, oh, this was the happy ending, they found each other, but look at, like, closer to modern day. What did they do with their time after they found out that they were brothers, after this whole media circus was over?
Right. And also the investigation. I mean, it becomes, in the third act, there's this whole sort of other character, this journalist who's investigating. Again, why was this experiment conducted? Who conducted it? Was it appropriate to conduct? Is it ethical? I mean, I think the answer is pretty obviously no.
It's not.
Right. And sort of also, what should be done with it? And I think that becomes part of the story too, which unfolds nicely in the third act. That's all I'll say about that, is that they explore all the way to the present day, and even in the after credits, if when the credits are rolling, there's some additional material that apparently was added, after they completed filming the movie.
Yeah.
Which I thought that nicely brought it all the way up to the current day.
Yeah, it did. And at first I was really upset by the ending because of the fact that the information about the research that was done was going to be locked up until 2066. But in modern day, it was told to us that the Callahans and other twins involved in the study now have access to those documents. So they are getting the answers. We just don't know what those answers are.
Right, and I think,
because part of it was redacted as well. I forgot to mention that.
Right, yeah, my day job creeping in on this, that's kind of appropriate, because if they were in the study, it is entirely appropriate to give them information about themselves. It is not appropriate to give them information about anybody else in the study, because that's their private information.
I agree.
And furthermore, there was this complaint that they didn't release the conclusions. But again, I would sort of say that goes to the privacy of the other participants. Not that they were willing participants. But,
agreed.
But again, just from a straight privacy perspective, each person getting information about themselves, but not anybody else, feels appropriate.
It does. And so, in conclusion, these are 2 really fascinating films that you need to see. One is a soft-hearted recommendation from Sanford. Is the other?
No, I like Three Identical Strangers a lot. I think I'd recommend it for anybody who is looking for an interesting story, well told as a documentary, and almost one of those this is so crazy. They got to be making this up.
Yeah.
'Cause, again, with the twists and turns that occur, it really has a great narrative.
It really does. So for next week, we're going to be talking about the movie Blind Spot, which will be out at the art this week. We will be back the week after next to discuss it and possibly one other film. We'll see what is in theaters at that time. Until then, I'm Chike Coleman, that's Sanford Hess, and we will see you at the movies. Bye, guys.